Ballots closed. Uganda went dark. 2 days before the election, the internet was shut down. Turnout was described as low, and reports surfaced of money handed out near polling stations, opposition agents chased away, and rules shifting at 10:07 a.m. to allow voting without biometric checks, while President Museveni spoke of expecting 88%. Counting started immediately, yet many doubted figures that seemed to follow the prediction. Ibrahim Traore asks, if the process is compromised, what does victory measure? A fast count, a slow reckoning. From this point, the promise stays simple and the stakes stay clear. What follows will not declare winners or invent totals. It will trace how trust erodes when procedures fracture. What matters is sequence and consequence. A national internet shutdown 2 days before voting, reports of intimidation and violence during the campaign, allegations of vote buying, and last-minute rule changes during polling hours. Each element alone raises concern. Together, they shape how results are perceived, regardless of the final announcement. The stakes extend beyond one tally. When citizens cannot communicate, observers are removed, and verification rules shift midstream. Confidence in the outcome weakens even before counting ends. Supporters of the opposition describe a system designed to limit scrutiny, while the incumbent frames the process as protection against fraud. Ibrahim Traoré's broader intervention frames this as a continental pattern rather than an isolated dispute. Pressing a simple test, can an election be judged legitimate if transparency collapses along the way? That question drives the analysis ahead. The first reveal sits in timing rather than totals. Voting ended, yet key constraints began before ballots were cast. 2 days ahead of Election Day, Uganda's internet was shut down nationwide. As a result, media outlets relied on phone calls instead of live feeds, citizens could not share images or reports from polling stations, and opposition teams struggled to coordinate observers. This blackout framed everything that followed. Reports from the ground describe low turnout, a pattern often linked to public belief that outcomes are predetermined. At the same time, the incumbent, in power since 1986, spoke openly about expecting 88% of the vote, adding that anything less would suggest theft. Opposition figures, led by Bobi Wine, argued the opposite, that signs of rigging appeared before voting even began. These included a contested voter register with alleged duplicate entries and inconsistencies, and accounts of intimidation during the campaign period. On election day itself, another shift occurred. Voters arrived expecting biometric verification through fingerprint or eye scans, as previously announced. Around 10 a.m., the procedure changed, allowing registered voters to cast ballots without biometric checks. To critics, this midstream adjustment raised questions about safeguards. To authorities, it was presented as a practical response to system failures. Without the internet, independent verification of either claim remained limited. As counting began, early figures showed the incumbent taking a strong lead, aligning closely with the predicted percentage. Supporters of the opposition dismissed these numbers as fabricated, arguing that control over communication, observers, and procedures made almost any result possible. Ibrahim Traoré's commentary highlights this sequence as the core issue. Legitimacy is shaped less by the final figure than by whether citizens can see, question, and verify how that figure is produced. The reveal, then, is procedural, not numerical. Early impact appears most clearly through individuals operating at ground level rather than in official statements. Polling agents aligned with the opposition described being removed from voting centers, sometimes chased away before counting began. Without their presence, they argued, observation lost its basic function. Journalists reported similar constraints, relying on fragmented phone updates instead of visual evidence, a limitation that shaped what could be confirmed in real time. One short case illustrates the dynamic. Bobi Wine traveled to Kiseni during the voting period to assess conditions directly. According to his account, the scene included intimidation and violence against known opposition supporters, with ruling party operatives allegedly distributing money from vehicles parked near polling stations. These claims could not be widely verified at the moment they surfaced, not because they were minor, but because communication channels were largely closed. Another impact emerged earlier, during the campaign itself. Opposition rallies were repeatedly disrupted, with reports of tear gas and beatings, including an incident in the capital about a month before the election. Such episodes repeated over time contribute to voter behavior. When participation is described as low, the explanation offered by critics is not apathy, but expectation, a belief that risk outweighs influence. This is where Ibrahim Traoré's framing intersects with local experience. He does not weigh individual allegations one by one, he points to accumulation. When intimidation, blackout, and procedural shifts converge, their combined effect shapes perception long before results are announced. The early impact, then, is psychological as much as physical. A process seen as unsafe or opaque alters choices at the polling station or keeps people away entirely. The event chain follows a clear escalation: activation, climax, and aftershock. Activation began before election day, when the internet shutdown took effect nationwide. Officials described it as a preventive measure against misinformation and violence. Critics read it differently, arguing that the blackout removed the primary tool for public scrutiny at the very moment it was most needed. With communication limited, the environment was set. The climax arrived during voting and counting. Reports described low turnout, contested voter rolls, and the removal of opposition polling agents. Mid-morning, the rules changed. Biometric verification, announced as mandatory, was no longer required. Authorities framed this as a technical necessity after system problems. Opposition figures framed it as manipulation. As counting started, figures emerged that appeared to track closely with the president's own prediction of 88% despite the described conditions. To supporters of the incumbent, this alignment confirmed strength. To critics, it confirmed design. Aftershocks followed immediately. Bobi Wine and his team rejected the emerging results, citing intimidation, vote buying, and procedural changes as evidence that the outcome could not reflect genuine choice. Human rights groups outside the country criticized the internet shutdown as an authoritarian tactic. Journalists and civil society actors spoke of working in darkness, piecing together fragments rather than observing a transparent process. In this sequence, Ibrahim Traoré's intervention operates as a reframing rather than an accusation. He points to repetition across the continent: communication cut, observers constrained, rules altered, and numbers announced with confidence. Each step narrows uncertainty for those in power while expanding doubt among citizens. The question he raises is not whether one allegation can be proven in isolation, but how the chain functions as a system. The aftershock is therefore not limited to Uganda. It lands on credibility. When leaders predict their margins in advance and processes bend to match those predictions, trust becomes the casualty. Elections still occur, ballots are still counted, but the meaning of participation shifts. The chain ends not with a single announcement, but with a lingering perception that outcomes are manufactured rather than earned. Quantified evidence in this case is limited, but the available figures still matter because of how they interacted with procedure. Three numbers recur in accounts from the opposition and the incumbent, each shaping perception rather than settling debate. First is the timing. The internet was shut down 2 days before election day. That interval matters because it covers the final campaign phase, voting, and the opening of counting, the exact period when independent reporting and coordination are most critical. Second is turnout, described repeatedly as low. No precise percentage is offered in the source material, but the characterization itself is consistent across multiple references. In electoral analysis, low participation often signals disengagement or fear rather than enthusiasm. Critics argue that intimidation during the campaign, combined with expectations of a predetermined outcome, discouraged voters from appearing at polling stations. The number here is qualitative, but its implication is concrete. Fewer participants narrow the base of legitimacy for any result. Third is the predicted margin. President Museveni spoke publicly about expecting 88% of the vote, framing anything less as evidence of theft against him. This figure became a benchmark before counting began. As early results appeared to align with it, critics treated the match not as confirmation, but as suspicion. The issue is not the size of the number alone, but its sequencing. A prediction announced in advance, followed by procedures that limit verification, and then results that mirror that prediction, creates a perception loop that is difficult to break. There is also a smaller but consequential numerical shift in procedure. At 10:12 a.m. on election day, biometric verification was reportedly abandoned, allowing registered voters to cast ballots without fingerprint or eye scans. Authorities cited technical challenges, opponents cited vulnerability to manipulation. Without live connectivity, external observers could not independently assess how widespread or necessary this change was. Ibrahim Traoré's broader framing connects these figures into a pattern rather than treating them as proof. 2 days of silence, a low turnout, a pre-announced 88%, and a mid-morning rule change form a quantitative outline of how control over process influences trust. The numbers do not resolve the dispute, they explain why, for many citizens, acceptance of the outcome becomes difficult regardless of what the final teller shows. A fair assessment requires engaging the strongest arguments from the other side. Supporters of the incumbent and government officials present several claims meant to justify both the process and the outcome. First, they argue that the internet shutdown was a security measure designed to prevent misinformation, incitement, and coordinated violence during a tense electoral period. From this view, limiting communication temporarily was framed as a trade-off to preserve public order rather than to suppress scrutiny. Second, authorities pointed to past elections, particularly in 2021, when allegations of voter theft were raised against the opposition. The claim that millions of votes were previously stolen was used to justify tighter control over the system and a shift toward electronic or biometric methods. In this framing, changes during voting were not manipulation, but adaptation to technical failures under difficult conditions. Third, the predicted margin was presented as confidence rather than cohesion. Long incumbency, supporters argue, reflects continuity and experience, not necessarily fraud. They note that opposition leaders often dismiss unfavorable outcomes in advance, preparing supporters to reject results regardless of evidence. From this perspective, accusations of fabrication are seen as politically motivated rather than empirically grounded. These arguments carry weight because they appeal to security, precedent, and stability. Yet critics respond by returning to process. Even if the intention behind restrictions was order, the effect was opacity. Even if past elections were disputed, changing rules midstream undermines predictability. Even if confidence is genuine, announcing a precise margin before counting invites doubt. Ibrahim Traoré's intervention acknowledges these defenses, but tests them against a simple standard. Do they expand or contract citizens' ability to verify? In this reading, measures that consistently reduce visibility, even when justified as protective, tilt the balance away from legitimacy. The Steelman does not collapse. It is contained by a procedural question that remains unresolved. The midpoint reveal is not a new allegation, but a shift in how the story is read. Attention moves away from who wins and toward how outcomes are insulated from challenge. With communication cut, observers limited, and procedures adjusted, the system no longer needs to persuade. It only needs to announce. The decisive factor becomes control over verification rather than persuasion of the voters. This is the moment where the frame changes. The blackout is no longer just a security measure, and the rule change is no longer just a technical fix. Together, they form a structure in which competing narratives cannot travel at the same speed. Official results move instantly through state channels, while counterclaims stall, fragment, or disappear. Ibrahim Traoré's broader point lands here. He does not argue that numbers are false by definition. He argues that when the path to those numbers is obscured, truth becomes secondary to authority. In such conditions, legitimacy is asserted, not demonstrated. A single line captures the turn: control the process, control belief. From this midpoint onward, the question shifts again. If a verification is constrained at the center, where do the consequences surface next, and who bears them first when trust breaks down? The practical consequences unfold unevenly across four groups, each absorbing a different cost once trust in the process weakens. For the state, the immediate effect is authority without consensus. An announced victory may consolidate formal power, but it carries a legitimacy deficit that complicates governance. Decisions taken afterward are viewed through suspicion, protests become more likely, and international scrutiny intensifies. Ibrahim Traoré frames this as a familiar regional pattern. Governments that secure office procedurally often spend the next term managing doubt rather than policy. For businesses, especially small and medium enterprises, uncertainty translates into hesitation. Communication blackouts disrupt transactions, logistics, and information flows. When elections are accompanied by instability or allegations of fraud, investors delay commitments and local operators reduce risk. Even short disruptions signal fragility. The cost is not only lost revenue during the blackout period, but reduced confidence in predictability, which is essential for planning and hiring. For citizens, the impact is more direct and personal. Low turnout, intimidation reports, and violence during campaigns feed a sense that participation carries danger without reward. When people believe outcomes are predetermined, voting becomes symbolic rather than effective. Over time, this erodes civic engagement. The immediate fear fades, but disengagement remains. In this environment, frustration often migrates from polling stations to streets or to silence, neither of which strengthens democratic accountability. For the region, the consequences extend beyond borders. Elections perceived as manipulated reinforce a narrative that democratic procedures in parts of Africa are cosmetic rather than substantive. This affects regional cooperation, election observation missions, and public expectations elsewhere. Ibrahim Traoré links Uganda's moment to a wider Sahel and West African context, where similar sequences have preceded unrest, coups, or prolonged instability. The ripple effect is reputational as much as political. Taken together, these consequences show why process matters as much as outcome. Even if order is maintained and leadership remains unchanged, the costs accumulate across state capacity, economic confidence, citizen participation, and regional credibility. The tally may close the election, but it opens a longer accounting that extends well beyond announcement day. Looking ahead 6 to 12 months, three broad scenarios emerge, each shaped less by vote totals than by how the aftermath is managed. The first is a base scenario of controlled continuity. In this path, the announced result stands, protests are contained, and the government maintains order through security measures and administrative authority. International partners issue cautious statements, balancing concern with pragmatism. Governance continues, but under a cloud of skepticism that slows reform and keeps tensions latent rather than resolved. The second is a more optimistic scenario centered on partial reopening. Here, authorities restore communication channels, allow limited space for civil society and media, and engage selectively with critics. While the election itself is not revisited, transparency improves afterward. This does not erase distrust, but it reduces escalation. Over time, attention shifts from the vote to economic and social performance, easing immediate pressure, even if underlying grievances remain. The third is a worst-case scenario of compounding instability. In this outcome, contested legitimacy fuels sustained protests, harsher crackdowns, and deeper isolation. Economic disruption follows prolonged uncertainty, and political divisions harden. In the regional context, such a trajectory risks spillover effects, as neighboring states interpret unrest as either a warning or a precedent. History shows that when post-election periods close rather than open political space, volatility often increases rather than fades. Across all three scenarios, one variable dominates: perception of fairness after the fact. Elections rarely end on voting day. They end when the losing side and the public accept the outcome as procedurally credible. Without that acceptance, even stability becomes fragile. This is less a prediction than a lens. Watch not the final percentage, but the months that follow. Communication access, treatment of dissent, and willingness to tolerate scrutiny. These signals will determine whether the election becomes a closed chapter or the first page of a longer crisis. For viewers following this story from outside Uganda, the relevance may feel distant at first, but its dynamics are familiar across many political systems. The immediate question is not allegiance to one candidate, but recognition of a pattern that affects ordinary lives when institutions lose credibility. When elections are disputed, everyday costs appear quietly: disrupted work, delayed decisions, and heightened anxiety about stability. Different groups feel this in distinct ways. Young people, often the most engaged in digital communication, are disproportionately affected by internet shutdowns. When access disappears, so do channels for expression, organizing, and economic activity. Workers in informal sectors lose income during periods of uncertainty, while professionals face interruptions that ripple through schedules and contracts. Families absorb the stress indirectly, adjusting routines around safety concerns and reduced mobility. For disparate communities, contested elections create another layer of tension. They follow events through fragmented updates, worry about relatives on the ground, and confront polarized narratives online once connectivity returns. Trust fractures not only inside the country, but within communities abroad, trying to interpret what actually happened. Ibrahim Traoré's broader framing resonates here because it moves the issue beyond personalities. He speaks to a shared experience of watching procedures bend while being told outcomes are settled. Viewers recognize this as more than a Ugandan question. It is about whether participation still carries meaning. The takeaway is practical rather than abstract. When systems prioritize control over credibility, the burden shifts downward. Ordinary people adapt, disengage, or absorb risk. Understanding the chain helps explain why election disputes matter, even to those who never set foot near a polling station. A solution pathway in this context is not about rewriting results but restoring minimum conditions for trust. The first step is reopening communication. Restoring full internet access is a prerequisite, not a concession. Without it, verification, journalism, and civic dialogue remain impaired, and every subsequent action is interpreted through suspicion. Timing matters here. Reopening quickly signals confidence, delay signals control. The second step is procedural clarification. Authorities need to publicly explain why biometric verification was altered, who authorized the change, and how integrity was preserved afterward. This is not about persuasion, but documentation. Clear records reduce speculation even when disagreement persists. Third, space for independent observation must expand after the vote. Domestic civil society groups, media organizations, and legal monitors should be allowed to review processes, not to overturn outcomes, but to map failures and safeguards. This creates an evidentiary baseline for future reforms rather than a perpetual argument about the past. Fourth, accountability mechanisms must be defined. Allegations of violence, intimidation, or vote buying require investigation, even if they do not affect certification. Ignoring them signals tolerance. Addressing them sets a boundary. The measure here is not punishment alone, but acknowledgement and corrective action. Finally, reform needs a timeline. Voter registers, verification systems, and campaign security protocols should be reviewed before the next electoral cycle, not during it. Progress should be measured by specific milestones rather than promises. Together, these steps do not resolve political rivalry, but they narrow the gap between authority and acceptance. Elections gain legitimacy, not when everyone agrees, but when disagreement can be examined openly without fear or blackout. The emotional thread circles back to the ground-level scenes that opened this story. Polling stations without observers, journalists calling sources instead of filming, voters weighing risk against voice. These images linger longer than any percentage. They shape memory. Over time, people forget exact margins, but they remember whether they felt seen or silenced. This is where Ibrahim Traoré's message gains weight beyond commentary. He invokes a shared African memory of elections that look orderly on paper but feel hollow on the street. The callback is not to a speech, but to a condition. Citizens cut off from each other at the moment their collective choice is supposed to matter most. In that silence, meaning drains from participation. Voting becomes routine, not agency. Acceptance turns passive, not earned. The emotional cost is subtle but durable. Passing from one election to the next has lowered the expectation. One line closes the loop. The trust breaks quietly before it breaks loudly. The point is not despair, it is recognition. If legitimacy erodes first in feeling, then rebuilding it also begins there with visibility, voice, and the sense that procedures are shared rather than imposed. The closing question is deliberately modest. It does not ask viewers to choose sides or declare certainty. It asks them to watch process, not just outcomes. When elections unfold under blackout, rule shifts, and intimidation claims, attention becomes a civic act. Following how transparency is restored or avoided matters as much as who occupies office. For audiences across the continent and beyond, this moment in Uganda functions as a mirror. It reflects how fragile legitimacy can be when verification is constrained, and how quickly authority fills the gap left by silence. Ibrahim Traoré's intervention invites a wider conversation about standards rather than personalities, about whether democracy is measured by announcements or by visibility. The soft call is simple. Keep asking procedural questions. Keep comparing what is promised with what is observable. Engage in discussion that stays grounded in evidence rather than allegiance. So the open question remains, when future elections arrive, will credibility be built in advance or repaired after the fact? And who will decide when trust is sufficient?